Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Tortoise. Thank you all very much for being here for this ThinkIn on childcare in crisis. What's the cost? My name is Jess Winch. I'm the news editor at Tortoise, and I'm delighted to be joined on stage today by Neil Leach, who is the Chief Executive of the Early Years Alliance, which is the largest membership organisation for the early years sector in England, by Ari Last, who is the co-founder of Bubble, which is an amazing app that connects parents with babysitters and with childminders for childcare. My colleague Phoebe is there, and she will be monitoring everyone who is also taking part in this conversation online, and we'll be bringing them in, so she will be catching my eye. If you haven't, I think most people here are tortoises, but if you haven't been to a ThinkIn today, this isn't about us talking at the audience. This is very much about everyone getting involved and pitching in. So as Mark said, if you're in the room, if you have a point, if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll get the mic to you. And just introduce yourself first. If you are online, as said, Phoebe will be watching for your virtual hands going up, and we will try and get you involved over the course of the hour. We scheduled this ThinkIn about a month or so ago. Was that? 'Cause after some heated discussions in the newsroom around childcare, how it is that a sector where parents at the extreme end are delaying having children and reportedly cutting back on their grocery shopping to be able to afford childcare. And the UK has some of the most expensive childcare in the world. And yet you also have a sector where nurseries and childminders are closing in their thousands because of financial pressures, because of difficulties recruiting. You have early years practitioners who are leaving because they are underpaid, they feel undervalued. This whole sector is in crisis. And on a broader sort of economic point, I think you have around 1.7 million women who want to work but who can't because of childcare pressures. So how do you try and unlock that potential? And then rather helpfully for us, Jeremy Hunt stood up and made childcare a rather big part of his budget. So that's made things a lot more exciting and has given us an awful lot to talk about over the next 60 minutes. So I will try and get as many people feeding in as I can. If for any reason I can't, then please keep following up with Phoebe, and we will pick this up as a newsroom going forward. So kicking things off then, I think, starting with the obvious news hook, which is the budget. Neil, starting with you and then turning to Ari. When you heard the proposals from Jeremy Hunt, what was your reaction?
I think an element of shock, to be fair, because we'd had no idea on some of these elements, particularly the extension for 9-month-old, 1-year-old, 2-year-old children. And you would think that something as substantial as that you would engage with the sector and you would have considered whether they were able to meet the demand, potentially. No conversation whatsoever, and that against a backdrop of constantly hearing, and this will be slightly political, I'm afraid, but ministers say, we're really keen to engage, we're really keen to listen, etc., etc. I never saw any of that, which was interesting. So shock was the first element of it. It wasn't overly surprising that they were going to make offers because, dare I say, other political parties were doing exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. So it felt like a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, although they will tell you they've been considering this for years. But it is interesting that we've had this announcement at a point in time where they're quite low. There's a pending election. And so I use the word appeasement. And the reason I think it is pretty grim for us is because the funding predominantly is going to the new offers. The crisis that we have is based on the existing system, and there was very little money or support for 3- and 4-year-olds.
And just to be clear on this was previously the offer was if you were a working parent or a household of working parents, you could claim 30 hours funded childcare a week during term time for 3 and 4-year-olds. And the difference now is that that's now being expanded to all children over 9 months old.
Correct, but it is still in the media, I have to say. Many are confused because they think it's what we term as a universal offer, that everybody will be entitled to this. There's qualifying criteria, and that is effectively you get back into the working environment or you do not get support for your 1-year-old and a 2-year-old. So it's important to just clarify that is the point. But that is a fair assessment. That's what the offer was before. But
then, just pulling up on that from what you were saying as well earlier, the problem before was that those funded hours were not funded. Is that right? Sort of only about 2/3 or so of the actual cost of giving that hour's worth of childcare
Correct.
was actually funded by the government.
Absolutely. Back in December of 2018, when we were tired of hearing governments say, we adequately fund these so-called free entitlement offers, we said to them, well, if you think that you pay enough money into the system, show us your figures, give us your computations. And they said, unsurprisingly, go away. So we filed a Freedom of Information request. 2.5 years later, they were forced to release some of the information by the Information Commissioner's Office. And I think you probably know what's coming, because why would somebody delay giving you that information? So we got this heavily redacted document, and I mean, it really was heavily redacted. But even then, in this document, it said, their words, not mine, to adequately fund the entitlements would require an additional £2 billion. That is not affordable. When you consider they were investing about £3.6 billion at that point in time, you'll see £2 billion was a pretty big shortfall. They then went on to say that they expected prices for early years care and education for those parents who do not qualify for these entitlements to rise by up to 30%. So they knew that parents who weren't getting these so-called free offers would cross-subsidise it. They then went on to say, my goodness, I wouldn't have done this, I'm sure, if I'd been in the department, but regardless, they then went on to say it would require a figure, and they expressly gave a rate of £7.49 per hour for a 3 and 4-year-old to be paid to providers by 2021. They paid in that year £4.89 on average. So you can see there is a massive shortfall. And the way in which providers basically make up that shortfall is they charge parents who do not qualify for these so-called entitlements. So the reason, coming back to your budget point as well, that I was greatly concerned is if you remove the ability to cross-subsidise, you're going to struggle. So the shortfall in terms of the 3, 4 and 2-year-olds as it currently stands, according to the government's own figures in funding, is £1.85 billion. They offer 204 million. We've seen record closures, as you alluded to, 5,500 nearly closures in the last 12 months, over 20,000 in the last 7 years. So this is a sector that's going like this. With an expansion programme, it's like that.
Yeah. So the big question is where do these places come from? I think the announcement would have been very welcomed by parents, but you're saying from the sector's point of view, from nurseries' point of view, you just look at this offer and go, how? How does that happen?
You summed it up, because the reality is there is no data. If you don't engage with the sector, you don't really understand what's going on. Do they really know how many settings at this particular point in time don't even offer 1 and 2-year-old provision? How many settings are restricted from a very practical perspective of offering 1 and 2-year-olds? I took the Shadow Secretary of State for Education to a setting just a few weeks ago that only takes 3 and 4-year-olds, is only open term time, does not have the capacity to take on any more children. I didn't take, but the Princess of Wales came to one of our settings in Luton just a few weeks ago. That setting is restricted on the number of children it can take. This is, for me, a superficial appeasement without too much substance and material to back it up. And potentially it's so deferred that, dare I say, this government may not have to actually deliver it. It may be another government. This gentleman here.
Yeah. Hello, John.
Sorry, I'm so angry that I have to put that out right now. Was any justification offered for redacting this reply to the FOI request? I mean, this is not national security, is it?
I think you probably know the answer to that, John, and the answer is no.
Charles.
Sorry, beg your pardon. No. And the answer is no. I'd love if that. I mean, that was pretty damning information, isn't it? Anybody that effectively says we're grossly underfunding you and this is what we expect you to do. I'd love to have known what was behind the blacked out areas of that document. I mean, it just demonstrates to me that there is no substance, there is no order. You just wouldn't do this in any other walk of life. You wouldn't play games.
But aren't they required to offer some reason, even if it's only generic, for redactions?
They are, and they offered some rationale, I suppose, at the end of the day. One is they felt it would damage future policy development. I would have thought honesty and being upfront would have been helpful. And that was the main reason that was given to us as to, first of all, why it took 2.5 years to get to that point. And I would suggest that's why they redacted the document. You might have some other thoughts as to whether there were comments in there that perhaps would be even more damning. And I can only assume that to be the case.
All right, turning to you, what did your users, the parents and the early years sort of practitioners that you helped connect, what was their response to the proposals made?
Similar to what Neil was saying, but I would say there was a mixed element to it. There was some potentially slightly short-lived, but at least it was their excitement or elation that actually, this was being talked about in the manner that it was. I think that is not an achievement in itself, but it's something to celebrate in itself. We've been building Bubble for 6 or 7 years and getting childcare any kind of attention, and that's the reason I started the business, because I was looking around and I had young children, and it just made me angry that it was just so under-resourced and so underserved in a world where certainly technology had transformed everything to make it easy, but childcare seemingly 30% of a parent's disposable income, without question, the biggest issue that parents face and worry about every day. The solutions to it were just shocking. So having Jeremy Hunt, clearly, and it was a very long budget and it was a big build-up until that big moment where childcare was in a way the star of the show, was something good. But at the same time, for all the reasons Neil's mentioned, there's a huge lack of detail and even substance to how this is going to be delivered. I mean, in some respect, there are subsidies, and one of the key areas we're focused on particularly is access, and flexibility of that access, because there are certain subsidies that are not being used today. Take tax-free childcare, which, this data shows is about 2.7 billion of underspend between 2018 and 2021. I'm sure there are lots of other reasons for that, etc. But fundamentally, you have government subsidy to fund the childcare, £2,000 a year, that is not being used by people, right? So all the talk about more funding, and absolutely more funding is needed without question, but there's also pots of funding that isn't being used because the process of getting your hands on it as a parent and where you can spend it and how you can spend it is not fit for purpose and isn't working. So as well as additional funding and the question of how actually providers are going to satisfy that demand is a really, really key question. But fundamentally, I think the questions need to be asked about how are we going to make it easier and more flexible for parents to make use of that funding, because it's insane when you hear about the horror stories in the UK about the cost of childcare and the struggles people go through, that there's 2.7 billion underspend, and you worry a little bit in a way that is underspend a good thing, for governments, right? Because it allows you to kind of roll out policies which make you look fantastic, but actually there's a benefit there if it's not actually utilised, which is a concern. So we are really focused, and we really believe, are looking at us specifically. So we do in-home flexible childcare. A lot of it is daytime. A lot of it is being used by working parents. And what we've been seeing for years is, what we offer is quite unique in that if you're a freelance worker or a flexible worker or a shift worker, often low income, and you work after the hours of 6 and you need someone for 2 to 3 hours, you go on our app and you find someone fantastic, by the way, teachers, nurses, many other professions on there. But it's crazy, these people are coming to us and saying, people on universal credit, or people, as I say, those adults I just mentioned, and saying, right, I've found childcare so I can go and work. I can't use my government allowance for it because the way that the legislation has been written is 2006, that you need to be via an Ofsted registered provider, which, without doubt, safeguarding, trust, safety is the most important thing. There is no corners to be cut there. However, that legislation was written before the iPhone was invented. How people do work, and both from a provider perspective and from a parent perspective, has changed immeasurably since then. And parents are being told, we're going to give you this pot of money, but we're only going to let you spend it in certain ways, which isn't flexible enough for how they work. And there is solutions out there that actually raise standards, raise safety, but actually increase flexibility. And it's absolutely crucial that parents not just get promised more money, but they're able to access it how they want to. Otherwise, it's fairly pointless.
Yeah. And I think the other element there that you must find too is that the funding that's been announced obviously only goes to working parents.
Yeah.
So if you are, for example, a trainee nurse, this doesn't apply to you. Is that right? You can't claim it.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting.
So what do you do?
Yeah, that's an interesting, not a moral debate as such, but it's very geared towards getting people back into work. But what if you fall out of that? Should you not get any childcare support? What if you want to stay at home and look after your children for a little bit? And again, there's all kinds of competing studies which talk about which is better, and I'm definitely not going to pass judgment on any of that. Nor should I. But we believe if parents need support, and they should be given that support, and they should be given more autonomy and more flexibility, obviously within a framework which ensures standards, as opposed to over the top regulation that actually dictates it in a way where a lot of them can't actually make use of it. We don't think that's kind of fitting for the modern age.
Sorry, so Louisa has put her virtual hand up, who's from the Post-Pandemic Childcare Coalition. If we can come to Louise on that point. I'll give them a second to do it.
What's been the chat so far online?
Not much in the chat, but Louise has made a point about the universality and the costs of that, so it would be good to come to her on that point. She's on mute.
Okay, well, if we hold on Louise 1 second. Brett is in the room.
Hi.
Oh no, she's here.
We've got a...
Sorry, Brett, I will come to you next. Can we get a microphone?
Hi, Louise. Thank you.
Hi, Louise.
Is that? Hi. So I suppose I can say that obviously, flexibility is important, but I think that it's the cost that largely stops people who need flexible hours from accessing childcare. And I think the really important thing to think about for all the problems there are with Ofsted, that if you start saying with what's happening with the plans, you've got this deregulation, you've got childcare ratios being increased, and you've got this push towards it just being thought of as childcare, when childcare is always early years education. So the government is shifting, the whole rhetoric is getting women back into work. And it's not about increasing an investment in early years education, even though, of course, childcare is always that. And that's all those Ofsted registered providers do the early years foundation framework. And so actually what we're seeing here is a shift from when back when they first did entitlements, it was 15 hours and it was universal, or it was 15 hours and it was targeted towards children who would most benefit from extra early education, for lower income children, and now we had in 2017 the 30 hours, which was just for working parents, and at the time the Sutton Trust said, this is giving more private education to the parents of relatively wealthier or better off the children of better off parents. So I'm a parent of a 1-year-old, so I'm supposed to be really grateful about this rollout. If it happens, I should, maybe I'll save some money. If the rest, the top-up costs don't get up, I will save some money for about 6 months. But I just think, it's a means-tested benefit that's going to go to families that with relatively higher incomes, not high, and then they're actually going to be reducing the quality of what's going on. And meanwhile, like, yeah, I'm paying. I don't like saying the percentage of my income, but it's because actually I share my parenting. So, but and I always feel like it's focused on like what the woman earns and the percentage of hers, if she's the one who should be doing the childcare instead. But about 20% of my budget goes on of our family goes on childcare. So it's, you know, it's major. But you know, at the same time, the early years workforce, who are also mainly women, 45% are relying on benefits to supplement their income. So, you know, and that's what needs to be addressed. We've had this underfunding, as Neil's described, that's just, you know, is actually like the underfunding is all falling. It's falling on women, yes, in both sense. And I think that, you know, we've seen this polarization this week where the government's announced this apparent revolution, which is nothing of the sort. And it's quite strange. I feel like I'm just talking into emptiness here. So I guess, yeah, I feel like the government's kind of divided and conquered a bit, or is trying to. And I suppose I'd quite like to hear from Neil about the way the sector has changed with the funding of the entitlements, and what you know, in terms of reform, like, is it just, do we want to just pour more money into like the market for early years childcare, or do we want to consider other ways of funding it that are more democratic? And what does he think, you know, in terms of what appetite do you think does he think there is within the sector for that? Because at the moment, obviously, this government funding is like that, you know, the ridiculous energy price guarantee. The government is paying a bit of the bills, and for-profit companies are benefiting. And there are amazing nurseries that are not-for-profit, that are just trying to get by, that have been, you know, running for years. They're just like, you know, we haven't had like public childcare rolled out in any real way. So, you know, they've been doing that work, but there are also lots of nursery chains that are making money for shareholders.
Thank you. You're not talking into a void. We all heard you. Thank you so much for that. Neil, do you want to respond?
Gosh, there's some pretty tough questions in all of that. What I would say is that the point about the shift from care and education, it was really interesting in the budget. I don't recall hearing anything that was about what's in the best interest of a child.
Yeah.
And what we are in danger of is turning children into commodities. They are statistics on a balance sheet rather than people that we should be creating good lives for. I want children to be kind. I'd like to sit next to the person next to me who's a kind person. I don't care whether they are a banker or whatever it happens to be. I just want people to care for our planet. The rest will follow. And the whole point is that this budget was about productivity, women's productivity, not about what's in the best interest of a child. And we get sort of a one-liner creep in there that says, oh, we're going to change the adult-to-child ratios for 2-year-olds, as if it just didn't matter. So I'm completely with you when it comes to that we're losing touch of what early years should be about. I don't use the term childcare. We don't in our organisation. It is early education and care. If you're educating a child, it's intrinsic that basically care is part of it. So, but I realise it's a common term, so I slip up every now and again, but it's education and care. This budget was not about that, full stop. Do I think that every child deserves the right to a fair start in life and a good education? Absolutely. And when you have that, you have to be very careful about the balance of, for example, private equity, private investment, and hanging on to what's in the best interest of a child. It should be part of community. It should be part of our social fabric. That's what other countries do. They value it. And just, can I say, on the tax-free childcare, one of the big barriers on that is that you have to put up 80% of the money yourself before you get the 20% back from government. Who does that appeal to? Not families in deprivation, families that have cash flow. We operate, as well as representing 14,000 nurseries, nurseries, preschools and childminders, we also run 60 settings ourselves, all in areas of deprivation, where frankly nobody in their right mind from a fiscal perspective would want to operate. But the return on human capital investment is fantastic. This time 4 years ago, we operated 132. So the whole point about which part of the sector are you destroying with some of these policies? I'm pretty sure it's rural communities, areas of deprivation, and dare I say, and I come from a banking sector, the haves will continue to have, and the have-nots will just sink even further down the line. This is about a child's education, not about propping up a particular part of the economy.
Thank you. I'm just going to...
So I'm just going to say that Dan Haskins put his hand up and was nodding along quite a lot to that. So we'll come to Dan in a second, but let's go.
So can I turn to Brett while we line Dan up to speak? Hello.
Thanks. My name is Brett Wigdorts. I run Tiny, which is the largest child minding agency in the country. And I used to run Teach First for 15 years. And the first thing I'd say is I totally agree with Neil that the whole point has to be about helping children and about and what got me interested in early years care, in addition to being a parent of 3 children who sometimes struggled to find good care for my children, is that there's so much evidence that's come out over the last 20 years around the importance of good early years education and around the importance for children's brain development for all sorts of reasons. And you could really draw a straight line that children who get better early years education do better in school, and that works, has a massive effect. And I would say if you want to do one thing to really improve the gap, which very sadly has started growing in the last few years between wealthier children and lower income children in attainment, you would fix early years. That's definitely the area that can make the biggest impact, I think, in getting that gap smaller rather than larger. I think a big part of this problem is around supply, which I think Neil and everyone would agree. And I think what this budget did is it grew demand. So it means there's going to be more demand for childcare, but it did really nothing to grow supply. And that Economics 101 says that's a problem. My point of view is there's a huge role for nurseries, there's a huge role for nannies and babysitters and others. I also think there's a huge role for childminders. Over the last 15 years or so, childminding numbers have just dropped incredibly. I think it's dropped 20% in the last 2 or 3 years. I think it's dropped about 50% in the last 8 or 9 years. And there's no reason why this drop should have happened. Childminding is actually a great job. You can earn a really good professional salary. You could do it from home. It's flexible. There's all sorts of great things around it to become an early years educator from your home as a childminder. But it's just never gotten the prioritization in government. No one's really looked at how to make this market work correctly. And certainly that's something we're pushing for, is how one of the ways to solve the supply crisis is get childminding working a lot better and really focus on that and increasing numbers.
And how do you do that? How do you get the supply market working better in terms of childminding?
Well, we've looked around the world and we've only seen 2 ways countries do it. One is you get a lot of money into local authorities and central government to focus on it. The second is you build a proper market that's really well regulated to do it. My belief is a proper market, really well regulated, does a better job around it than going through local authorities. I think the problem is no minister has made a decision how they want this to run over the last 10 years. Everyone's kicked the can down, and I think they need to make a decision. How do they want, the childminding sector to operate? How do they want it regulated? Who do they want to be responsible for growing numbers, for increasing a supply of childminding? Currently, no one really has that responsibility in the system.
Thank you. Should we turn? Is Dan wanting to come on now from online?
We can turn to Dan.
Hello.
Yep. Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
We can, yes. Hello.
Yep. Hi there. I'm Dan Haskins from Save the Children, and certainly nodding very much when others were talking about the sort of importance of focusing on children's outcomes, in all of this. I think the underlying issue, of course, is over the last 15 years, the investment in the system has been intended to do some very different things, and it's therefore been a sort of confusing mismatch of different objectives, starting with kind of early education, moving on more recently to sort of parental employment. And one thing that a report that we commissioned by the IPPR and Sam Friedman recently made the case for needing to think about a really sort of comprehensive universal childcare guarantee, looking sort of from the age of 9 months, the end of shared parental leave, right through to the end of primary school. And I think incremental bits of investment into the current system clearly aren't going to achieve things. That said, I guess I'm probably a bit more positive about kind of the recent budget announcement than sort of some of the other speakers, not on its own merits, because I agree with all the concerns raised, but I think it can be a sort of first step towards some of the changes that are needed in the longer term. So one of the reforms announced was the way that paying childcare costs up front for families in receipt of universal credit. And this is a campaign which 5 years ago, there was a group of mums who themselves received universal credit, had young children, sort of started making the case for with the support of Save the Children, told it was impossible to do, that it wasn't a priority. Some MPs said, oh, we totally agree, but you need to persuade the Treasury. The times it seemed impossible to get that change, and then it was announced. There is hope there, and I think really, this agenda has been driven by sort of parents, not putting up, with the system, and really sort of coming together in all kinds of ways. Sort of fantastic work that's been done, and it just shows, that where reforms are possible. I think also, while I agree that the sort of primary focus of early education shouldn't be on parental employment, I think it is a big step forward that the role that childcare has in supporting economic growth is recognised. It does unlock a whole different discussion about investment and prioritisation. The fact the Office for Budget Responsibility says this is the biggest job creating measure in the whole budget puts the whole debate about future investment in a whole different light compared to obviously the many other sort of public services which need investment. I think there's a principle there, but that's been conceded and which can be built on in future. And I think that if there had been a hope that just by announcing this money it would make this issue go away politically, I think it's done the opposite. I think it's raised the salience of it, and it's the sort of first step. I think all main parties will have to come back with sort of further proposals to fix the funding gap that Neil mentioned, and to bring forward, I guess, sort of things that combine both investment and reform. Because as other speakers have said, putting more and more money into this current system, with more and more money than going out into private equity, into debt servicing, into profit, still not delivering. That can't be the answer. So more investment is needed, but alongside the reform, the sort of broadening of different kinds of supply, the growth of multi-site not-for-profit childcare provision, the growth of provision of sort of childcare early education attached to primary schools. There's a lot of opportunities here, and I guess the thing that gives me most hope is that while there's a lot that needs to do, it needs extra money at a time public finances are tight. It does need reform. As public policy problems go, this isn't a particularly complex one. This is one where we've got a pretty good sense of what the future should look like. There is now a cross-party consensus that this is an important thing to solve. There is a real, sort of short-term sort of crisis and that sort of thing, but it is possible to see a sort of future in which, some of the existing challenges are met, where there's greater quality, and sort of focus on children's outcomes, sort of focus on sort of flexibility, greater flexibility, and also availability and affordability. So I guess just offering, hopefully, quite a hopeful perspective on sort of recent developments, not because they've solved it in and of themselves, but because I think they are first steps, hopefully, to a better future.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. One person who I think is online is Jolie Brearley, and I've
said that she wants to chat.
I will. Okay. Well, first we will go to Anna. Yes. Hello.
Hi. I would just like to say that I was in childcare. I'm a qualified nursery school teacher myself. I was in childcare for 20 plus years, and I gave it up because the constraints placed on teachers were becoming more and more, and it was making it impossible for me to do my job properly, i.e. I couldn't give a cuddle to an upset child or a child who is anxious. I felt as though I was being continually monitored, and also the money that is given to the schools doesn't get down to the teachers, because the schools have to spend money on give money to the health and safety executive, and spend money on training teachers and safeguarding. It was just becoming really impossible.
Thank you. Should we bring
Jolien?
Jolien. Yeah, Jolie, I know I've spoken, I've heard speak before about how talking to ministers about childcare in previous years was like talking Klingon, I think you said. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about that kind of process of how childcare has become, as Dan said, at least part of the debate, and if you would as well to talk a bit to the cost to parents, to mothers in particular at the moment of the dysfunction within the market.
Yeah, sure, happy to. So, yeah, I've been talking about childcare for a long time as part of Pregnant Then Screwed. And as you just said, the conversations we would have even 2 or 3 years ago, you know, they would look at you like you had two heads. They'd just be like, that's just not interesting to me. We have no interest in talking about childcare. So to go from that to it being the most significant element of the Chancellor's budget, for us was really exciting. And of course, I fully, always, completely agree with Neil. He knows that, and he articulates the issues very, very well. And I get that there's an enormous staffing crisis in childcare that really needs to be fixed, that the funding rates are nowhere near what they should be. But still, to us, that was a really big moment, and we feel that the only way is up from here. And if the government don't get this right, if they don't fulfil certainly that first stage of the pledge, which is due to happen in April 2023 for 2-year-olds, it's political suicide. You know, it's just before the election. If they screw it up, that is perfect fodder for Labour to say you couldn't even implement the first stage of your major plan. The only way they will fulfill it is if they manage to bridge this staffing crisis and if they manage to deal with the supply issues. So the pressure really is on them now to get this right. Not only that, but we expected this to be the battleground in the next election. The fact that it's happened before the next election means that by the time manifestos are being written, both Labour and the Conservatives are going to have to go further. You know, Labour are going to have to top this. They're going to have to come out with a better plan. Conservatives are going to have to top their own plan. So we really feel quite energised by the fact that this is the first step. And yes, this isn't centering babies, and this isn't centering quality. It is definitely centering working parents, predominantly mothers. But I think it's really important to say that the number of mothers that have left the workforce because of an expensive, ridiculously unaffordable childcare system is astronomical. You know, we know there are at least 870,000 mothers who don't work because of childcare costs. We know there are 1.7 million women who work fewer hours than they want to. And it is a key cause of poverty, child poverty in this country. And that enabling parents to work and get the money in the bank so that they can survive and thrive is good for babies as well. So yes, there's a lot to do on quality to get this right. But at the same time, if the government can fulfill the pledges that they've made, there will be enormous benefits to families across the UK. And just, we were talking a bit about nurseries being private businesses, and I absolutely agree with all of that. 70% of providers in this country are private businesses. The biggest nursery chain in the UK is Busy Bees. It's worth millions of pounds. It's a Canadian company. All of the money goes straight out of the UK. And I feel very uncomfortable with the idea that some providers are making a lot of money out of children's early years education. Not many are, most are running at a loss right now. But as we start to invest more public money in this sector, I think we really need to look at the whole picture holistically and see it as a public service, as a public good. So I very much agree with Louise O'Hare, I think it was, who spoke earlier. I wasn't going to say anything. I was just going to sit here quietly, but I obviously can't help myself. So thanks for letting me wax on.
Thank you very much for taking part.
Jolie hasn't changed, I have to say. That's the natural Jolie.
Well, picking up on that, I think I'd like to sort of just think ahead now. I think we've all given some good reflections on what the budget said, some of the positives that you can take out of it, some of the very obvious shortfalls that you can see coming down the line. But where, if you are looking at a point now where coming up to an election, both parties are going to have to top this, where should we go from here? What should be on the agenda now to try and, as you say, fix some of the issues you can already see screaming at us, and also just look more holistically at the whole sector?
I think you start with, well, obviously you have to have a strong infrastructure in place to deliver anything, and the infrastructure is the people that work within it. And we are viewed, we don't refer to practitioners, we refer to educators. Because if you don't fix the recruitment and retention crisis, then nothing will happen. You know, when you look at the percentage of people, every year I'm singled out almost by the Low Pay Commission to go and appear in front of them and explain why it is that our educators are some of the worst paid people in this country. We don't value people in early years. We think they are effectively, this is going to sound slightly detrimental, but glorified babysitters. So we don't talk about education, we talk about care and making sure that they don't run out into the streets. And if you want to do that, you could sellotape children to chairs. They are educators. So until you get professional development, until you get these people who feel like they are professionals, you will not change a single thing. And there was nothing in the budget that looked to actually lift the esteem, lift the profession. We did an analysis of around 1,500 respondents in terms of why people leave the sector, etc. 77% of people who were contemplating or had left the sector said they left because they felt undervalued. 72% left because they felt exhausted. Only 57% said that they were leaving because of money. But yet when you come to money, as somebody alluded to, I think it's pretty appalling that 45% of the people that work in the early years sector are having to claim benefits, tax credits. So Louise said that. So that's one. Secondly, if you look at the ability to obtain a mortgage, for example, the average property price across the country in February was about 294,000. You have to have 5 early years educators living in a house together so that they can basically buy and combining all their income so they can buy the average house across the country. If you're a refuge collector, and this is not about degrading anybody who's in the area, you only have to have 3 people. If you're a post person, you only have to have 2.5 people. That's where we place early education. So until you recognise that this is a profession, it's hard to see that anything will change. And education does not start when a child walks through the school gates. And that's what we think happens in this country.
So your big focus for the next step will be to focus on the practitioners, not just in terms of pay, but in terms of how they are valued and the rhetoric around how they are valued.
It would be treat them as if they are teachers, and they are teachers. Treat them as if they are shaping our future generations. We'd rather we can't find a few billion for the early years sector, but we can find between 80 and 100 billion for a rail link that's been over budget since its conception. Now, which one to you is more valuable? The lives of children? We don't say that.
Sorry, so Jonathan Broadbury's put up his hand from the National Day Nursery Association.
Great.
We'll just give him a second.
Yes, let's go. Jonathan lined up. Ara, can I just come to you and ask the same question in terms of next steps, what you think should be, what you would like to see in the next sort of 6 to 12 months ahead of election?
Yeah, look, I think nothing should be off the table. I think Daniel on the call said it earlier. You know, piecemeal reform of a clearly broken sector is very, very difficult to do. And I'm sure Labour will be looking at how, because they're going to need to top what's come out, right? Like wholesale reform. I think a couple of things on our side, you know, as Neil said, the obvious thing is fund it properly. You know, if you're going to make promises on the demand side, you know, the sums need to add up.
Yeah.
And the two are completely hand in hand. So there's no such thing as happy parents and content children and unhappy providers and practitioners. It just doesn't work. You need both. I don't necessarily think that all childcare is early years. You know, I think it's okay to have a separation between the two. There is other forms of childcare that doesn't necessarily need to be early years education, and parents absolutely need that. And sometimes I think those two issues are conflated, which causes a problem. You know, there's lots of situations that working parents need. And, you know, as Jolie was saying, you know, the impact, not just on the economy, but the impact on those families and those kids is profound when parents can go out and work and are happier, etc. So I think it's really important that there is a delineation between those two things. But what certainly can't happen is we look to benefit, you know, productivity at the expense of early years, right? So that's really important. But yeah, fundamentally, we need to increase supply. But it's interesting, right? That, and I don't know the answer to this, but there is some deep-seated psychological issue, probably not just in this country, where childcare is just people don't give a damn. They just don't. They just, and you know, it happens when you talk to ministers. It happens privately when you talk to investors. People just don't think it's an issue. It's strange, and the consequence of that is it's massively undervalued. You know, the people working in the sector are massively undervalued. It's strange because they do the most important job in the world. The things that parents, and you see it even sometimes with parents, I must say as well, right? Like the way sometimes we treat our carers, or we treat our teachers, or we treat our childminders, or our nannies, etc. It's strange because on one hand, the expectation level is sky high. It needs, you know, it's very binary. It's either like 5-star and the best, or it's not good enough. And trust me, you're going to hear about it. But we don't value them. It's really odd, right? And that then feeds down into what should we pay them, etc. So the issue, and I don't know the answer, is I'm very sceptical of like, right, we're going to do a government marketing campaign to try and attract people to the sector. So I don't know what the answer there is, but I think the root of the issue, or a lot of these issues, because it doesn't make any business, logical, or financial sense. Why childcare? Why we're in the situation we're in? You know, especially the funding that's going into other areas. You know, especially the amount of workers, the amount of money in the economy that's being. There is no rhyme or reason for why we're in this situation, other than not enough people care about it fundamentally in power. Now, hopefully, that's changing, but until we tackle that issue, it's hard to properly solve it, I think.
Can I just say that's why we don't use the word care, childcare, because it seems to me in this country, if anything has the word care attached to it, it's a very good reason to pay low salaries. So whether it be early years, whether it be elderly care, whatever it happens to be, attach the word care and it's a good excuse. A, it's predominantly a female workforce, and B, it's a good reason to pay low salaries. If it was education, and that had always been, if you like, inherent in the conversation, we'd be in a different place.
Should we come to Jonathan?
Yes.
Give him a second to come up.
Hello, Jonathan. Thank you for
Hi,
joining.
thank you. Hi, yes. So much like Jolie, I'm incapable of staying silent on these kinds of issues. So we represent the national network of nurseries across the whole of the UK. So we're obviously talking to providers an awful lot about what needs to change, and I think a lot has been said about the overall funding, which is absolutely right, because you can't properly value people working in this sector until that underfunding is addressed. And going back to the kind of the theme of this discussion is of what's the cost, because the focus for the budget was very much about what's the cost of not getting parents back to work, and we know as a policy it's one that can pay for itself if you properly invest in early education and care. Then parental earnings help to pay for that policy, and that's been shown around the world, and most notably in Canada, I think. But what's the other side of it? And picking up on what Neil said about being really child focused, because if you provide that really high quality care and that opportunity for learning, so it's not. I often hear people say, well, we need to distinguish between sitting children down and teaching them, whereas what we're talking about in early years is every single thing that a child does is a learning opportunity when they're playing, when they're interacting with peers, when they're interacting with those crucial adults who are working with them. Everything is a learning opportunity. So we are prepared as a society to be paying £16 billion a year to fix things later in life that we've got wrong in those crucial early years, that 0 to 5 stage of development. And the Princess of Wales Royal Foundation work has been really crucial on this, in terms of highlighting that 1 in 5 people don't know just what a difference getting it right in the first 5 years can truly make. So I think I agree with points that Jolie's made and Dan about this is putting it front and center. So there's a very high risk for governments not getting this right now. By no means the funding isn't right. The system by which funding is delivered to providers, by which parents access those benefits, that isn't right. That leads to billions of pounds underspent. That leads to millions of pounds sitting in different budgets and not getting fully utilised. And it can mean that, you know, children miss out in the year that they're in a nursery, and the local authority might come to the end of the year and say, oh, actually, we haven't spent as much money as we thought we were going to spend. So we need to, you know, put that into another budget, or we need to, you know, we need to retrospectively correct underfunding. That child has moved on from a nursery or from a childminder. So they're never going to have that opportunity again to be in that learning environment. So we need to fix it so that the support that is there is maximised and follows the child that it's supposed to support. And if we have an overcomplicated system that has been built year on year in a piecemeal kind of way, we're not working smartly. So there's things that can be addressed in terms of the structure, but absolutely, if you don't recognise the people working in the sector, you don't recognise the professionals and the expertise that they have, you don't properly reward them, and you don't inspire the next generation. So one thing that we would really love to see is child development being taught within the GCSE curriculum, not as a separate course, but, you know, this is a crucial stage, and not enough people know about the vital importance of this stage of development. If you can get children themselves, when they're getting inspired about being an engineer or working in the police or whatever their aspirations are, you know, that is the time to inspire people to think, I'm not going to go into early years because it's the only thing that my careers advisor can think to recommend to me. I want to work with children because the best practitioners, the best teachers, the best professionals in the sector are those inspirational features. And if anyone has a chance to have a look at NDNA's First 5 Years Counts campaign, we've got a video about that, because there are some really really well qualified people working in our nurseries, and as Neil says, we need to be investing in them so that they are doing the work that their expertise allows them to do. What we don't want to see is a workforce crisis, a shortage of professionals, so that those people who should be the leaders, should be those early years leaders, having to come and work within ratios in on the floor of a setting. You know, they can provide some inspirational leadership. You know, they should be working with children, but they should also be helping to bring through the next generation of leaders. But at the moment, we've got such a great number of vacancies that, you know, people are hard pressed to even be able to run day to day, and that's what we need to get away from. And in terms of what comes next for the next election, I am hopeful because of the priority that's been put on early years education and care. I also worry about, you know, people saying, well, they've got to top it. And what we risk is getting into an arms race of what sounds good, what sounds inspiring, what looks good on a billboard, not thinking about what is best for children, what is best for families, and what is deliverable. Because if we go down the route of the same mistakes that were made in the 30 hours, you know, that was a big peace announcement. That was an arms race between the Conservatives and Labour. And what we ended up with is a system that's led to more settings closing, whether they're nurseries, whether they're childminders, and parents picking up the costs, whether that's unavailable places or having to pay those extra charges.
Thank you. I really like what you were bringing in there, which is essentially that rather than an arms race and everyone trying to pledge more money to a system that's already not funded based on previous pledges, what should be happening is much more about what does good childcare look like? Like, what, rather than these piecemeal pledges, what is the overall view of what do parents need, what do children need, what is the infrastructure, I suppose, that can enable that to happen, not from, as you say, when they walk from the doors at 5, but actually from birth to 5, what does that whole system look like?
I think it needs an independent review. Your point about piecemeal, in the last 10 years, we've had 22 early years ministers and secretaries of state who've been impacting the early years, and everyone has come in, bolted on their little bit, and then they're wondering why we have this hybrid, hideous system. In any other walk of business, that would scream alarm bells about continuity and consistency, and we don't have it. So I think it needs to be taken, we need to take a step back, have an independent review, and ask what is really best for parents. Because you know what? Not every parent does want to go back to work when their child is 9 months old. I was asked by Sir Terry Leahy a while ago when he was the chairman of Tesco's to speak at a conference of Tesco's. And I said to him, what about it? He said, well, can you come and talk about how we can get mums back to work as soon as possible? And I said, well, I'll talk about it, but let me talk to parents. Let me talk to some of your people that have returned and some are on maternity leave. I will tell you the vast majority of people that I talked to said, we don't really want to come back. They talked about how they'd go home in the evening and they would give their children more sweets, they'd buy them more toys because they felt guilty that they didn't have much time with them. In other countries where they look at this in a wholesale basis, they support families, they support mothers, fathers. It isn't just about economics. I come from a banking background. So I think I understand the importance of fiscal policy. I used to chair the Finance Industry Standards Association, but I think it's an awful stage where all we think, I come back to this point, is children are a mechanism. Well, we've had them. Now they're in the way, so let's get the parents back to work. I just look at it from a holistic position.
I agree with that, but I think there's also the point to be made that, as I think has been mentioned, that there are a lot of women who want to work and can't.
And this is about choice.
So it's about choice, exactly.
Yeah,
it is about building a system that women have, the parents have the choice to
phase back in, perhaps, and to take alternative options. You know, as I say, it's part of society. I don't think this is anything that other countries, many other countries, particularly Scandinavian countries, they found a way of doing it.
What do you think good childcare looks like? I think this will probably be the last word, right? This is, yes, sorry, we've gone over the hour.
Yeah, no, I think good childcare to one parent will be different than another, and that's the key point. You know, I think parents deserve the choice and the flexibility and the freedom, again, within certain standards, right, to determine what good childcare looks for them. And I think part of the issue with the current system is it's kind of shoehorning people down a particular route, which not only do they not want, but it actually doesn't practically work for them. So, yeah, it's different to different parents, and we need to recognise that.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think we will end it there. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for taking part. Thank you to Neil and to Ari for coming up on stage.
Pleasure.
And hope to do more on this. I'm sure there will be more to do on this.
I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.